Bibliophiles of the internet, we somehow find ourselves in the last month of 2025, which means it's time to wrap up the 14 books I read in November. No backstory, no qualifiers needed. Let's just jump right in, starting with the first book I finished in November, which was The Devil She Knows by Alexandria Bellafleur. Berkeley Romance kindly sent me a finished copy, and PRH Audio also granted me access to the audiobook, which is read by Ellie Gosage. This is a sapphic paranormal romance about Chef Samantha Cooper, whose life has completely unraveled over the past 24 hours. She proposed to her longtime girlfriend only to be publicly rejected and also kicked out of their apartment, and then she gets stuck in an elevator with a gorgeous woman who claims to be a demon. Daphne, the demon, offers Sam 6 wishes in exchange for her soul, and Sam is more than willing to make that trade because she figures if she can be smart about it, she really just needs one very carefully worded wish in order to fix her relationship and win back her ex. Content warnings for some descriptions of experienced infidelity, brief references to familial death and grief, brief references to a past suicide attempt, and some explicit sexual content. I know Alexandria Bellafleur has written a ton of queer romance, especially sapphic romance, so her work has been on my radar for quite some time. This was my first time reading from her, and I would definitely say I enjoyed myself. I thought this was a really fun spin on a paranormal romance. Even though the story revolves around demons and selling your soul, it's surprisingly lighthearted, and there's also a cool, almost multiverse aspect to the story that I did not expect. Every time Sam makes a wish to improve her life, it throws her into a temporary alternate reality, and she kind of has to figure out what exactly is different about this version of the world and this version of herself as she goes. I also appreciate the underlying sentiment of the story, which is that the relationships in our lives can't just be wished better. Healthy relationships require some level of work or emotional labor that everyone involved has to be willing to take on. If everyone in the relationship isn't invested or isn't able to reciprocate a certain level of care, then all the wealth and privileges in the world won't make a difference. So even though Sam's wishing for all kinds of external gratification, like a bigger bank account or a better job, what she actually wants is to feel like she's enough and that she's worthy of being loved exactly as the imperfect person she is. And there's no wish in the world she can make to get that kind of unconditional love from her ex. All that said, I wasn't fully sold on the budding romantic relationship between Sam and Daphne by the end. I think the story has a very difficult line to walk in the sense that there is a pre-established relationship that Sam is desperately trying to hold on to, a relationship that we, the audience, know is not endgame and also is not worth holding on to, while also trying to build a new romantic bond with another character in the background at the same time. That's a really hard balance to strike, and I'm not sure the story ever fully gets there. I think Sam and Daphne definitely have undeniable physical chemistry, but I wasn't able to fully buy into the romantic, emotional piece. So in the end, I gave this 3.75 stars. After that, I read The Everlasting by Alexi Harrow. I bought a finished copy myself, but I was given access to the audiobook courtesy of Macmillan Audio, which is read by Sid Sagar and Moira Quirk. This is a mind-bending, heart-rending, time-loop medieval fantasy story that begins with a legendary knight known as Una Everlasting, the greatest hero of Dominion who famously gave her life for queen and country. Centuries later, there's a scholar named Owen who falls in love with her story and becomes one of the foremost scholars on the subject. His obsessive study of Una's tale eventually actually sends him back into the past, where he becomes bound up in Una's story and also is there to make sure that her story plays out the same way over and over again, no matter the cost. Content warnings for explorations of parental death, child death, and grief, some descriptions of war including graphic injury and violence as well as war-related PTSD, non-graphic allusions to grooming, non-graphic allusions to rape and abortion, some use of ableist language, and some sexual content. This is easily one of the best books I've read all year, if not one of the best books I've read in my life. It fucked me the fuck up and got under my skin in ways that I can't even really express. This may not be the most coherent, in-depth review you'll find of this book, but I genuinely fear I will never be the same as the person I was before I read this. This book is just an absolute masterclass. It is nothing less than a truly stunning depiction of a love so stalwart, so loyal, so tender, so powerful, so bound by both fate and choice, and it rewired every last pathway in my brain. And as is the mark of a truly special story, I honestly have no idea how the author was able to pull off something this grandiose and ambitious. At the end of the day, this is an epic love story exploring how love in its purest form is really a commitment, not only to protecting each other and showing up for each other in every way we can, but also saving each other over and over and over again and fighting to free each other from the chains that bind us, even when we are the ones holding those chains. To me, this is really a story about what it means to create a person, not just biologically, but in terms of mythologizing people, writing other people's stories into existence, binding people to our expectations, and therefore turning those expectations into self-fulfilling prophecies, realizing that the choices we make don't just impact ourselves, but ripple outwards and change other people's lives and stories in microscopic ways we could never expect. I think it's a very empowering story as well, in the sense that it shows how power can be big, overwhelming, and devastating, but power can also be small and quiet. It can show up and be wielded in very subtle ways, and even the smallest of our choices can still make a difference. This book really and truly wrecked me through and through. The sheer level of devotion, yearning, and literal undying affection is so heady, so intoxicating, so powerful. I just really have nothing else I can add at this point. This was a truly incredible read, and it deserves nothing less than 5 stars. Then I finally picked up my copy of Big Chief by John Hickey. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by Sean Taylor Corbett. This is a contemporary indigenous story set in the Anishinaabe Passage Rouge Nation and following a young law school graduate and aspiring political fixer named Mitch, who basically follows around his best friend Mac, who happens to be the nation's president. On the eve of Mac's re-election, absolute chaos breaks out on the res. Not only is the rival politician Gloria stirring up drama and trying to peel back the veil on Mitch and Mac's less than legal movements, but her assistant Layla happens to be both Mac's estranged sister and Mitch's long-lost love. Content warnings for references to drunk driving, parental death, and grief, mentions of infidelity, some depictions of police brutality and gun violence, allusions to death by suspected suicide, references to childhood experiences of bullying, brief references to animal cruelty, and some graphic depictions of blood, injury, and violence. I really enjoyed this debut from John Hickey. I think it's a really strong addition to the Indigenous canon, especially because it's committed to depicting how Native people show up and exist within the modern world, which may seem like a really simple thing, but in fact, systemic erasure is one of the biggest forms of oppression that Native communities continue to face. When people think of Indigenous nations and cultures, they often have a very antiquated vision of how those nations conduct themselves and exist. Sometimes it's impossible for people to reconcile the reality of the modern world with how Native people exist today, effectively relegating them to the past. And this story is showing how Native communities are contending with technology and social media and political corruption just like everyone else. Something I didn't expect this story to tackle, but I'm really glad that it did, was the topic of tribal enrollment, especially by way of tribal rolls, which are basically very imperfect records conducted by the US government in an attempt to document all Native citizens. Now, it may seem affirming on the surface, but as you might guess, it actually originated as a form of surveillance. Anyways, the story is really tackling how official enrollment is a privilege and also something that can be weaponized against Native communities in so many ways. And even though it's meant to serve a bureaucratic function, it's become a kind of marker of cultural and social status. Now, there are many reasons why people with legitimate claims and legitimate cultural ties to Native nations are not able to formally enroll themselves in the proper nations or tribes, a lot of which are purely bureaucratic barriers to entry. If you want to learn more about that, I highly encourage you to check out The Indian Card by Carrie Lowry Schwetpels, which really delves into that topic with complexity and nuance. But I really appreciate that being a key piece of this story because it allows the book to explore all the ways that Native people are made to feel not Native enough, even by their own, and how these divisions between people who are enrolled versus those who are not enrolled is a government-created division that only serves to further uphold an ongoing colonial white supremacist project. I feel like this story is really exploring the lengths we might go to in order to quote-unquote legitimize ourselves, even if it comes at the expense of our community, our friends, our neighbors, or our loved ones. That's happening on a very high level for Mitch, who gets to wield a lot of power as basically the second in command in his nation, so the question becomes, what is he willing to do in order to maintain hold of that power? And it's also happening in smaller ways with how he treats his community and the people in his life, even though in theory he became a tribal lawyer so he could help those in need. So this really messy, fascinating power struggle comes to light when you put this small nation under a microscope and look at the ways that corruption can come from within as much as it can come from without. This was great. I look forward to seeing what John Hickey writes next, and I gave this 4.25 stars. Then from my library, I picked up An Academy for Liars by Alexis Henderson. So this is a twisted, deeply fucked up dark academia story. It's a contemporary fantasy tinged with some horror elements and following a character named Lennon who just found out that her fiance has been cheating on her. And since she put her life on hold to support his career path, she really has nothing going for her and nowhere to go. That's when she gets this mysterious phone call inviting her to take the entrance exam for an institution known as Drayton College, where they teach students the dark art of persuasion, or the ability to forcibly exert one's will will over other people, and in rare cases, over matter itself. Content warnings for experienced infidelity, references to mental health episodes including suicide ideation and suicide attempts, graphic descriptions of seizures, scenes involving hard drug use, drug abuse, and overdose, graphic depictions of death, injury, blood, and violence, and some allusions to past experiences of domestic abuse. This was my first time reading from Alexis Henderson, and I was really impressed by what she was able to accomplish in this book. I especially appreciate how this is a dark academia story that doesn't pull any punches and isn't afraid to say the quiet part out loud, especially in regards to how power will inevitably be abused and misused wherever power exists. I think there's this idea, especially in the US, that academic institutions are inherently neutral because they're supposed to be built on pillars of keeping knowledge and sharing knowledge, which are seen as noble, apolitical pursuits. But academia, like everything else in the world, is indeed political, and these institutions, especially those that are privately funded, are tremendous sources and sites of power. This story isn't afraid to explore how academia is not the gateway to legibility, legitimacy, professional experience, or prestige that it promises itself to be. It's a system of power that siphons away energy, time, and resources from the very same students it claims to serve, and merely acts as yet another way to divide between the haves and the have-nots. That's something Lennon is really having to grapple with in the story. The fact that what drives her to stay at Drayton isn't that she loves learning, isn't because she wants to better herself or her life, isn't because she especially even cares about wielding power and magic, but because being there makes her feel like she's been chosen and she has some greater purpose in life. Because Lennon is one of the school's only Black students, that also adds another layer of complexity and intersectionality in the way that the story examines how marginalized students especially are preyed upon by these institutions and have to both endure and sacrifice so much more than their peers in order to be considered successful. We see that in very literal ways as this institution drives Lennon closer and closer to her own demise. We see what she's willing to do, how far she's willing to go, and what she's willing to overlook in order to be accepted among and even elevated above her classmates. So there's definitely a lot to consider here. The dark, creepy, twisted atmosphere of the story and the ever-shifting stakes also kept me engaged the entire way through. I would definitely read more from Alexis Henderson in the future, and I gave this 4.25 stars. On a very different note, after that I picked up my arc of Starshipped by Cat Sebastian. I was kindly sent an early copy by Avon Books, and this one comes out on March 3rd of 2026. This is actually Cat Sebastian's first ever contemporary romance. It's about two rival actors, Simon and Charlie, who work together on this long-running sci-fi show that's basically a fictional spoof on Star Trek. Simon kind of feels like his time on the show has run its course, so he's planning to move to New York so he can pursue working on stage. But because he and Charlie have a very well-documented grudge against each other, Charlie is worried that if Simon suddenly leaves the show, the press will blame Charlie and it'll look like Simon left because of some kind of behind-the-scenes drama. So Charlie has to go on a bit of a road trip to check up on an estranged family member, and he invites Simon to come along with him so they can be seen acting friendly with each other in public. They'll interact with fans and post a bunch of road trip content on social media so everyone thinks they're getting along famously. And of course, because Simon is ready to move thousands of miles away, it's a purely harmless farce that is definitely not going to impact their relationship in any kind of way. Content warnings for depictions of anxiety, compulsive behaviors, and chronic migraines, some depictions of panic attacks, some descriptions of experienced homophobia, references to past experiences of workplace abuse, non-graphic references to past issues with addiction, alcohol abuse, and substance abuse, and some sexual content. Also worth noting, Simon has clinically diagnosed anxiety and is also navigating a possible OCD diagnosis. The amount of pure joy this story brought me simply cannot be described. It made me giddy, it made me laugh out loud, it made me absolutely melt, and by the end I just felt so much for these two bumbling idiots than I ever could have expected. Honestly, the fact that this is Cat Sebastian's first ever contemporary romance is almost the least interesting part of the story. It doesn't even factor into my experience of reading the story, and it really has no bearing on how deeply this story made me feel for the characters, because even though it is set against a modern backdrop, it's still just everything that Cat Sebastian does best. This is one of those absolutely delightful romances where there's kind of a plot, but there's not really a plot, but also there doesn't have to really be a plot because it's the connection between the characters that is so profoundly compelling and that really drives the story forward regardless of what's happening around them. Just the sheer level of character work in this story is tremendous. Case in point, there is no third act breakup because Cat Sebastian Sebastian understands that sometimes allowing ourselves to be loved and finding ways to show the people we love that we love them is the true challenge, is the true conflict. That is the mountain that needs to be climbed. And honestly, that's as high stakes as it gets. It doesn't need to be exacerbated any further by all kinds of external factors, because what could possibly matter more than that? And I also love that both Simon and Charlie are extremely anxious, neurotic people, but their anxiety shows up in very opposite ways. Simon's anxiety is very much an internal struggle. He constantly worries that he's doing or saying the wrong things and bothering, annoying, or inconveniencing the people around him because of it. And Charlie, on the other hand, gets very anxious when the people in his life need help and he has no way to provide that help or that relief. So it's interesting to see how they approach things in very different ways, but at the same time, even though they struggle to regulate their own feelings or thoughts, they really are doing their best to show up for each other and themselves in healthy and thoughtful ways. There's also a really fantastic thematic parallel between Simon and Charlie's professional lives and the romantic relationship they're discovering together, because the story is showing how even though something takes work, whether that's acting or PR or being in a relationship, that doesn't mean that it's fake or that it's not work worth doing in the first place. It's okay to have needs. It's okay to have to work on things or have to work towards things. That work just shows how much you care, which is profoundly human. Trust me, I am definitely not doing this book justice. This is just the very tip of the iceberg in regards to how absolutely wonderful this book is. It healed something within me. It brought me so much joy. It was a beautifully safe place to land for a few days. I highly recommend checking it out when it comes out in March. I had no choice but to give this 5 stars. After that, I actually reread a book, something I don't think I've done in years, but I wanted to revisit a book I really loved ahead of watching its film adaptation, so I did reread Hamnet by Maggie O'Farrell, and I did once again listen to the audiobook read by Elle Potter. This is a fictional take on the life and loves of William Shakespeare, but is told from the perspectives of those around him, ranging from his wife to his children to other people populating his life. It's set in England during the 1500s when the Black Death was wiping out countless lives, and this story posits that plague as the cause of his son Hamnet's tragic death. Again, there are many perspectives, but the story is mostly told from Agnes's point of view, Shakespeare's wife, and retraces the story of how they fell in love, how they made a family together, and how the loss of their young son not only changed their family forever, but how that inspired the infamous play Hamlet that continues to have a profound cultural impact even centuries after its creation. Content warnings for instances of child abuse, descriptions of violence, injury, and illness, graphic descriptions of childbirth complications, instances of sexism and use of sexist slurs, brief use of ableist language, explorations of death, child death, and grief, allusions to depression and depressive episodes, and some sexual contents. I'm not going to say too much about this because I have read and reviewed it before, but I'm so glad I made the time to come back to this book because it is absolutely a masterpiece. I've said this before, but this definitely feels like something written in the style and tradition of Madeline Miller's work, just because it's also a story that's taking this larger-than-life historical figure and instead puts the focus on all the people populating their life, granting those so-called side characters a fullness and a richness that makes that well-trodden narrative even more complex. It's actually to the point where I noticed on this reread that the story never once names William Shakespeare as such. He's the Latin tutor, the playwright, the husband, the son-in-law. It's really fascinating to see how he's both central to the story and not at all part of the story all at once. And I still think the structure of the story is brilliant because you can really feel how past, present, and future are playing out within this family all at the same time. The story often takes a moment of high tension or high stakes and then suspends the reader in that tension as the perspective then switches to something that's already happened or something that's yet to come in order to really drive home all the small moments and choices that had to happen in order for the current scene to play out the way that it does. The prose is executed in a way that's so powerful and so beautiful. It's such an emotional story that has tremendous impact without being overwrought in my personal opinion. And I still think the build up to the end as well as the ending itself are perfect in every sense of the word. Like there's no other possible way this story could have ended and you really feel that. Originally I think I gave this 4.5 stars, but this time I'm giving it 4.75 stars. I'm actually going to talk about the next 2 books I read together because they're part of the same series, but very spontaneously, 8 years after I read the last installment, I decided to finally finish off the Fairyland series by Catherine M. Valente. I listened to the 4th and 5th books as audiobooks. The 4th book is read by Heath Miller, and the last book is read by the author herself. To avoid spoilers, I can't really get into what these last two books are about, but very broadly speaking, this is a middle grade fantasy series about a 12-year-old girl named September who is greeted by a strange man in a green jacket calling himself the Green Wind, who offers to whisk her away to Fairyland. It turns out the Marquess of Fairyland is very fickle and unpredictable, and Fairyland needs September's help in pacifying the Marquess if she wants to help protect all the wonderful new friends that she's made in this peculiar, marvelous place. Content warnings for the fourth book include some depictions of slavery, instances of bullying, some depictions of kidnapping, some allusions to experiences of dysphoria, and brief references to child death. Content warnings for the fifth book include some references to death and some experiences of blood, injury, and thematic violence. First, I do want to say that I believe this author has been called in the past regarding some insensitive representation of different cultures in some of her other books, not in this series, so I am conscious of that, and I obviously do not endorse cultural appropriation or misrepresentation of any kind, and I would hope that she's learned from those experiences since. That said, I don't think I have too much to say about these last two books in the Fairyland series. I think they're every bit as delightfully off-kilter, imaginative, and inventive as the first three books. If you love absurdist fairy tales like Alice in Wonderland and the Phantom Tollbooth, and you're looking for a more modern take on that kind of classic fantasy, then you'll most likely enjoy this series. Thematically, I think the fourth book has a lot to say about the power of being yourself, and also staying true to yourself and never wavering from that truth, even when other people are trying to tell you who you're supposed to become, or when they're trying to force you into a box, especially one that doesn't fit. I think there's a great underlying message about how you know yourself best, and how so-called common sense isn't actually as common as people claim it to be, and even though something might be common or normal doesn't mean that it's going to be right for everyone. The fifth book, as you might guess, is more of an epic conclusion that takes the characters all around Fairyland and revisits a lot of familiar faces and places as these characters put everything on the line to try and help this fantasy world finally find its footing in some way. Even though continuous chaos is very much the bedrock of this entire series, I did feel like there was maybe one too many ideas jam-packed in this last installment. It's a very busy, ambitious story, and I'm not sure it entirely succeeds in everything it's trying to accomplish. I do think it comes to a fairly satisfying conclusion and has a solid message about how it's okay to not know everything or have all the answers, especially in an ever-changing world. So I do appreciate both of those things. In the end, I gave these last two books 4 stars apiece. After that, I picked up an anthology called Legendary Frybread Drive-In, edited by Cynthia Leitich-Smith. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by a full cast. This is a YA collection of intertribal indigenous stories. The basic conceit is that there's this somewhat magical place known as Sandy June's Legendary Frybread Drive-In, which can move through time and space in order to appear to indigenous folks who need its safety and hospitality the most. So the stories in this anthology are kind of interconnected, and we follow a bunch of different characters as they discover and interact with this space. Content warnings for experiences of both external and internalized racism, references to cancer, explorations of parental death, grandparent death, and grief, descriptions of a car accident as well as resulting injuries, brief non-graphic references to residential schools and related trauma, and some explorations of family estrangement. I have such a deep respect for this anthology's project. It truly is a celebration of community while also being a commentary on the complex, expansive nature of Native identity, both in a personal sense and a legal sense. I feel like the pieces in this anthology really make a statement about the necessity of expanding our concept of what it means to be Native, not in the sense of making space for those who want to exploit Native identity and Native resources, but rather to make space for Native people to claim and experience community both with their own and on their own terms. Whether or not the characters in this anthology are res natives or urban natives, whether they're legally enrolled or not legally enrolled, whether they have a strong or direct connection with their history or not, each and every one of them is invited into this magical place, and they realize that they all belong there regardless of their history, their relationship to their culture, or their status. I think young Native readers especially absolutely need stories like this in their lives. It's incredibly rare to come across an all-Indigenous anthology that centers and celebrates Indigenous joy in all its complexity and intersectionality, which is why I'm just so glad that this exists. And I also appreciate how the stories in this collection don't oversimplify what it means to experience Indigenous joy. It's not joy at the expense of realism, because even though there's some really beautiful moments and the anthology overall is building towards something revolutionary and hopeful, the anthology also makes space for confusion, hurt, loss, and grief. Being in community with other people doesn't mean just holding the good things, it also means holding the difficult things and finding strength through community to navigate them and understand how they fit into our narrative. So I appreciate that there's a real range of experiences, both in terms of identity and emotion, to be found in these stories. I thought this was really great overall, and I would definitely recommend it. Even though there were a few pieces here and there that didn't feel fully fleshed out, I still thought this was a really strong collection, and I gave it 4.5 stars. And of course, I could not resist picking up yet another Cat Sebastian release, so I read After Hours at Dooryard Books by Cat Sebastian. Cat Sebastian will occasionally self-publish queer romances, and this is her most recent self-pub release. It's a queer historical romance set in New York City during the late 1960s. There's this elderly landlady who owns a secondhand bookshop as well as the apartments above, and she has a tendency to bring in strays. Basically, people struggling with something, navigating loss or addiction or homelessness, and she allows them to work in the bookstore and live in the apartments rent-free until they can get back on their feet. The co-owner of the bookstore, Patrick, used to be one of those strays, and he now enjoys a simple, quiet life working in the bookstore. But his routine gets turned upside down when a mysterious new tenant named Nathaniel comes to stay at Dooryard Books. Content warnings for explorations of family death, a past instance of child death and grief, references to past experiences of suicide ideation, mentions of drug use, some panic attacks, explorations of war and war-related trauma, and some sexual content. Listen, you can never go wrong with a Cat Sebastian book. I genuinely do not think it's possible for her to write a bad book, in my humble opinion, and frankly, these days, she's putting out some of her best work. This is another story that's very simple on the surface, but really excavates this tender, soft around the edges kind of intimacy that is every bit as powerful as it is subtle and quiet. This is also another one of those romances that kind of has a plot, what with Patrick trying to unravel the mystery of who Nathaniel is, where he comes from, what he's been through, what kind of support he needs, but I would also say it's not an especially plot-driven story, and again, it doesn't really have to be because the connection between all the characters, not just the two main characters, is really the heart of the story. Cat Sebastian has such a great knack for exploring unspoken forms of intimacy and connection, especially all the ways people quietly observe each other and learn so much about each other from the ways that they move and the ways they act. There's so much that we reveal about ourselves with just our daily habits, our routines, our tendencies, and before the characters even really open up to each other because of that attention to each other, they're able to form a real sense of closeness. I also think the story makes incredibly effective use of its historical setting, especially since it's set against the backdrop of the Vietnam War and the Civil Rights Movement, because it ends up being a much needed reminder that the kinds of political unrest and pessimism that we're contending with today actually does have an incredibly storied precedent. These characters also believe their country is in a hopeless, irredeemable place. They don't agree with the government, they're struggling to hold all the ways the world has violently changed around them, but they're also being reminded of how there are still things worth fighting for, and there are still things worth taking risks for, especially preserving community and community spaces. At its heart, I think this story is really about destigmatizing this idea that needing help is an indication that you have failed in some way. I think the reason why a lot of people struggle to ask for help when they need it is because they don't want other people to look down on them, to assume that they've made a mistake or done something wrong that they can't fix themselves, or because they don't want to be indebted to someone else. This story is a really beautiful, tender-hearted reminder that there will always be people who need help, just like there will always be people who have help to give. Receiving help and giving help is a beautiful, natural, symbiotic form of human connection, and one of the most essential and foundational forms of human interaction there is. There's nothing unnatural or shameful about that kind of exchange. I think this is an incredibly timely reminder that there are so many small ways we can show up for each other and show up for ourselves that may never make headlines, but will sure as hell make a difference. I absolutely adored this story from beginning to end, and I gave it 4.5 stars. Then I picked up my Patreon pick for the month, and for November, my patrons voted for me to read How Far the Light Reaches by Sabrina Imbler. I listened to the audiobook, which is read by the author themselves. This is creative nonfiction. Sabrina Imbler is a queer, non-binary, mixed-race journalist working in the field of science and conservation, and they have a particular interest in studying sea creatures who live in hostile or highly remote environments. So each chapter in this book focuses on a different sea creature and catalogs how these lesser-known organisms present some of the most radical models of family, community, and care. And the author also intersperses those essays essays with elements of memoir as they use these findings as a metaphor through which to filter their own experiences. Content warnings for experienced fat phobia, internalized fat phobia, and descriptions of diet culture, calorie counting, and disordered eating. Experienced racism, some references to the commercial killing of animals, as well as scientific descriptions of animal injury and animal death, brief mentions of mass shootings and mass destruction by fire, and brief descriptions of domestic abuse, rape, and sexual assault. I thought this was absolutely fantastic. I think this is truly outstanding nonfiction writing because it's able to balance both the personal and the scientific. You will definitely learn a lot about deep sea life, but you'll also feel something as the author expertly alchemizes the science into a seamless metaphor for their own personal experiences. I think each chapter of this book is able to strike a really effective cadence in the sense that there's a rhythm to the way the author jumps back and forth between the elements of science writing and memoir, and I think they display a really strong grasp of both. I think what also makes this stand out is that it's informative and really well researched, but it very much lacks the kind of rigidity that you'll find in a lot of science writing. The format, the style, and the way the information is presented is being queered in some ways, because while it does meet a certain standard of academic rigor, the form itself also leaves space for a lot of creativity and playfulness. For example, there's a really great essay about whale falls, which is when whale corpses slowly sink to the ocean floor and decompose along the way, providing resources, nutrients, and even a living environment to bottom-dwelling ocean creatures. And that chapter is structured like a necropsy report in which the author documents the slow death of a romantic relationship. So I think the author is able to make some really worthwhile connections between the scientific and the personal elements, and by the end it really does feel like putting those two disparate pieces in conversation with each other makes all the sense in the world, because those pieces really do reveal something vital about each other. I do think there were a few tiny moments where the author was maybe forcing the metaphor a little bit too much or in a way that was slightly repetitive, but that's a very, very minor note. I still highly recommend this, and I gave it 4.75 stars. After that, I read a couple more picture books for work-related purposes, so while I will not be rating them, I still wanted to share about them. The first of those was Rock Your Mocs, written by Laurel Goodluck and illustrated by Madeline Goodnight. This is a really fun and inclusive Indigenous picture book inspired by Rock Your Mocs Day, which is a holiday observed every year on November 15th as a way for Indigenous communities to celebrate their cultural diversity by wearing traditional footwear in public. The book shows a wide variety of Indigenous children from regions all across Turtle Island, showing the differences in their traditional footwear and celebrating the beauty of these traditional garments. I thought this was a really wonderful picture book, especially because both the writing and the art are taking care to be as inclusive and expansive as possible. Obviously, not every single tribe and nation can be represented in a single picture book, but I do think this is a really beautiful tribute to the fact that Indigenous communities are incredibly diverse and anything but monolithic. We also get to see how this traditional footwear varies from region to region. Different regions use different materials based on what's available to them and what makes most sense for the terrain. And I love the way that was shown in the artwork, while the text itself is more focused on all the different young characters. The book also showcases a lot of different languages and dialects from region to region, even taking care to name the characters within the convention of their specific regional dialects. So there's a lot of attention to detail here that I think is really great, especially for young readers. Again, because I read this for work, I'm not going to give a star rating, but I thought this was really lovely. There's a lot of great information in the book's back matter as well, including thoughtful notes from the author and artist. There's a pronunciation guide as well, which is great for accessibility. So if you have a young reader in your life, I would definitely recommend this. The second picture book I read last month was At Our Table, written by Patrick Hulse and once again illustrated by the incredibly talented Madeline Goodnight. The story is really about acknowledging all the ways we can celebrate each other and give to each other, not just during Thanksgiving, but all year long. Whether it's the joyful preparation of food, quiet reflection, honoring history, enjoying time with friends or family, the possibilities of what we bring to the table are endless. Just to be transparent, the illustrator of this book is Indigenous, but the author is not. I think this would make a really fantastic read-aloud book to read with young readers, especially around the holiday season. It's just a really open-hearted, celebratory story about all the different things we can make space for at our metaphorical table, and how we can welcome so many different experiences, emotions, feelings, and traditions. It talks about how there's space at our table for enjoying quality time with friends and family, and there's also space for us to honor where our food and our traditions come from, even if that history is challenging, and there's even space for us to hold grief and difficult feelings that holidays might bring up for some folks. I think it's a great message, and I think it's great how the tone is able to be both celebratory and positive while also acknowledging hard truths about the holiday season. Again, I think this would be a great book to read with loved ones around this time of year, and personally, I will definitely be sharing it with my nibblings when they're old enough to read it themselves. And the last book I finished for November was This Gilded Abyss by Rebecca Thorne. This was recently re-released by Tor Books and published published on November 11th. Tor did kindly send me a review copy, and I listened to the audiobook read by Natalie Nadas. This is a sapphic fantasy that has a slight horror/thriller tilt to it. It's about Sergeant Nix Mar, who is determined to never be deployed underwater again, especially after a horrific incident caused her best friend Keon to be killed in the underwater mines. So when Velkesh's favorite royal, Sabar Cassandra, comes to request that Nix help her investigate a massacre in the underwater city of Fall, Nix absolutely refuses, in part because Cassandra also happens to be her ex. But Cassandra is extremely powerful and assigns Nix to be her personal bodyguard aboard the Luminosity regardless, and it turns out this investigation isn't actually about a massacre, but rather what caused it, a mysterious contagion that incites its victims into a violent rage. Content warnings for descriptions of war and war-related trauma, including death, grief, and post-traumatic responses, some graphic depictions of death, injury, and violence, depictions of contagious illness, explorations of classism, and some explicit sexual content. I feel like I was destined to really enjoy this, especially because it's pitched as Titanic meets Arcane, two of my favorite pieces of media. And listen, when you tell me a story is set on a doomed luxury liner trapped hundreds of miles under the ocean and centering a sapphic second chance pairing, there's no chance in hell I'm not gonna read that. Then top that off with the fact that the main character is acting as a bodyguard to their ex, torn between performing her duty and grappling with the still smoldering flames of their passion. That is very much my shit. But in all seriousness, I thought this was a dark, thrilling, high-octane fantasy adventure. There's actually a rich, complex political backdrop to the story that also really ups the stakes. I really appreciate how the story explores political corruption and systemic classism, showing how these soldiers are trapped in more ways than one by the oppressive systems they either knowingly or unknowingly serve. Because of that, I think the story being set on this doomed underwater luxury cruise liner is actually an incredibly effective setting for the story, not only because it's a very contained, almost claustrophobic space that lends a sense of intensity and urgency to the story, but because those feelings of being trapped in a confined space while fear and chaos are unleashed is actually an incredibly apt metaphor for how it feels to live under corrupted and oppressive systems. That idea was explored a little bit in this first book. I hope we see it even more in the sequels, but it was at least a solid starting point for those conversations. I do wish the romance between Nix and Cassandra was a little more slow burn, especially because they're trying to find their way back to each other after being apart. I feel like their reunion was a little bit rushed, especially considering that this is the first book in a trilogy, and because it happened so quickly, it just doesn't have that emotionally satisfying payoff. I also think the pacing and the world building is a little bit off because a lot of complex new lore is dropped right before the end, which intellectually I understand because the story is trying to build some kind of intrigue or lead into the next book, but it just ends up feeling messy, and I think it could have been paced out with a little bit more finesse. But I definitely plan to continue on with this series whenever those sequels are published. I thought this was a solid series starter with tons of action, intrigue, and romance, and I gave it an even 4 stars. So that is everything I read in November. If you've read any of these books yourself, or if you plan to, I would love to hear your thoughts, or feel free to share your favorite book that you read in November down below in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and until next time, educate yourself, be kind to yourself, take care of yourself and others, and I will catch you on the flip side of the page.